Good evening. My name's Debbie Prentice, and I'm the Vice Chancellor of the University of Cambridge. Welcome to the West Road Concert Hall for the 2024 Sir Robert Reed's Lecture. I thought I'd begin by telling you a little bit about the lecture, which is so important that it warrants mention in the university's statutes and ordinances. The statutes say, the appointment of Sir Robert Reed's lecturer shall be made annually by the Vice Chancellor. The lecturer shall deliver one lecture in full term, the time and place of delivery being fixed on each occasion by the Vice Chancellor. So here we are. Though surely there is much more that we should know about this event. To begin with, who was Sir Robert Reed? We can't be sure of the year of his birth, sometime in the late 15th century, but we do know that in the reign of Henry VII, he rose to become Chief Justice of the Common Pleas. In other words, he was the head of what was then the highest common law court in the English legal system. Interestingly, he served as one of the executors of Henry VII's will. But why are we gathered here today in his name? When he died in 1519, Sir Robert left a £4 annual stipend to finance 3 lectureships at Jesus College, one for logic, one for moral philosophy, and one for the humanities. In 1858, this endowment was consolidated and used to support a single annual lecture known ever since as the Sir Robert Reed's Lecture, or more simply among friends, the Reed Lecture. An article published in 1871 in what was then a new scientific journal called Nature declared the Reed Lectures to be, and I quote, one of the highest intellectual treats of the whole year, as will at once be acknowledged when the names of the distinguished persons who have delivered it since its establishment in 1858 are known. Indeed, the list of Reed lecturers offers a rich mix of some of the world's most influential thinkers, sharing some of their most interesting thoughts. This list includes physicists like James Clerk Maxwell and J.J. Thomson, writers like E.M. Forster and John Betjeman, art historians like John Ruskin and Kenneth Clark, inventors like Sir Clive Sinclair, and actors like Sir Peter Ustinov, politicians like Shirley Williams and Leon Britton, heads of state including Ireland's Mary Robinson, conservationists including Sir David Attenborough and Jane Goodall. The roll call of Reed lecturers is multinational, multidisciplinary, and even multilingual. The 1899 lecture by Alfred Cornu on the theory of luminous waves was delivered in French. In his very famous Reed Lecture of 1959, the novelist and chemist C.P. Snow lamented the growing gap between the two cultures, the sciences and the humanities. Yet, observed over its long existence, this lecture series stands as a robust answer to Snow's concern, straddling as it does the worlds of science and of art. As an American in England, my attention was drawn to the title of the Reed Lecture delivered in 1975 by the British broadcaster Alistair Cooke. He called his lecture The American in England, Emerson to S.J. Perelman. In it, he reflected on the effect that visits to England had on the work of notable American expatriates and Anglophiles. Pondering the grandiose nature of the lecture itself, Cooke remarked, "The almost irresistible temptation is to rise to the occasion. But, dodging that temptation, he continued, 'Ladies and gentlemen, I shall try not to rise to the occasion.'" Our Reed lecturer tonight has always risen to the occasion. She has been called Britain's best-known classicist. She's also been called the nation's favorite classicist. I like that one better. She is the author of some 20 books, including her most recent, Emperor of Rome, Ruling the Ancient Roman World. Professor Mary Beard studied classics at Newnham College, where she went on to complete a PhD. She lectured for a few years at King's College London before returning to Cambridge in 1984, where she taught classics for almost 40 years. A tireless advocate for opening her field to new audiences and readerships, upon her retirement, she created a scholarship fund to encourage disadvantaged students to study classics. Since her retirement, however, she has been busier than ever. A prolific blogger, a vigorous tweeter, and a regular presence on TV and radio, she is also the Royal Academy of Arts Professor of Ancient Literature, the Classics Editor of the Times Literary Supplement, and a trustee of the British Museum. For her services to classical scholarship, Mary Beard was made an Officer of the Order of the British Empire in the 2013 New Year's Honors List. In 2018, she was upgraded to Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire for services to the study of classical civilizations. The title of this year's Rede Lecture is The Boy Who Breathed on the Glass at the British Museum. What or whom is the past for? To deliver the lecture, and without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Mary Beard.
Thank you very much. It's a hard act to follow. It is, I think, particularly hard to imagine giving a Rede lecture that competed with the amazing showmanship of the one that was given in May 1878, it's 145 years ago, by James Clerk Maxwell, who Debbie mentioned, the first Cavendish Professor of Physics here. The lecture was entitled simply The Telephone, an instrument which had been invented just 2 years earlier and which Clerk Maxwell felt he had to explain to his audience in the Senate House. This is what he said. The speaker, the person who's speaking, talks to the transmitter at one end of the line, and at the other end of the line, the listener puts his ear to the receiver and hears what the speaker says. But the highlight for the audience must have come with the unexpected live practical demonstration. For a short distance away and out of earshot in the Geological Museum, which was then housed in the old university library, a certain Mr. Gower played the tune of Men of Harlech on a complicated machine known as a telephone harp. This contraption combined an electrical current, metal plates, and something like a piano hammer. And it's all explained, if you're interested, in great and to me incomprehensible detail in an article in the Electrical Review of May 1878. But basically, on this occasion, it transmitted the music down the line to 4 receivers strategically placed around the audience, one of which was the actual original prototype made by Alexander Graham Bell. They heard the music and they were duly amazed. And that was Cambridge's first encounter with the phone. But there was more to this lecture than a great showbiz-style demonstration. Clerk Maxwell was also making a bigger point. It was about what we would call the interdisciplinary scholarship that underpinned progress of this kind. The invention of the telephone, he insisted, depended on the study of music, acoustics, language, and more. The lecture was, in fact, a sideways reflection on the nature of this university, of universities in general, and their intellectual culture and pedagogy. And amidst all those different themes that Debbie mentioned to start with, that has been perhaps the most recurring theme in the whole series of Rede lectures since they were re-established in this form in 1858. From, as Debbie said, C.P. Snow's Two Cultures, to Honora O'Neill's elegant and completely devastating dissection of snow in 2010, from Matthew Arnold on literature and science in 1882, which was a kind of inverse prequel to Snow, to Kenneth Weir's lecture in 1967, entitled Universities in the News, in which he earnestly urged universities never to court publicity, right? I'm afraid that he'd be horrified that we have not quite heeded his advice. But in all this, there's an odd gap. Despite the long history of museums and galleries in Cambridge, there is not a single lecture that gets closer to the museum than Mr. Gower playing his telephone harp in the Geological Museum. So this evening, I'm going to try to redress the balance a bit, drawing partly on some local examples. I want to focus on the disputes and contestations that have always, for more than 250 years, defined the modern museum. And that will prompt me towards the end, briefly, to wonder if there is some takeaway in this for our own approaches to the past more generally. My first exhibit is on the screen now. It is a full-page cartoon by H.M. Bateman from Punch in 1916, with the title that I've borrowed for this lecture, The Boy Who Breathed on the Glass in the British Museum. It tells the tragic story of a young lad who goes to the BM to see the Egyptian mummies, and peering at them, blows on the glass. For this, he is arraigned by the gallery attendant. He's handed over to the cops, he's banged up in the cells and taken to court, where he's handed down a hefty sentence with hard labour. He's not let out, as you see in the second frame from the left here, until he's an old man. At which point he goes straight back to the British Museum, he breathes on the glass, and there isn't, I'm afraid, going to be a happy ending here. He drops down dead. Right. It's a story that is more puzzling, I think, than it looks at first sight, for this sinister tale is not remotely typical of Bateman's work. His cartoon series called The Man Who is otherwise made up of much lighter themes than this, which are mostly concerned with definitely non-fatal breaches of etiquette. The man who threw a snowball at Samoritz, or the man who asked for a double scotch in the Grand Pump Room in Bath. And the point of this cartoon isn't quite as clear as it might first seem either. It's tempting, very tempting to read it as a parable about class, the flat cap signalling the working class kid clashing with the elitism of the museum. But if you look more carefully at the kids' clothes and at those of Mum and Dad, as they say their tearful farewells to Sonny, you'll see that they're all dressed, Mum and Dad in particular, pretty posh. Dad is actually holding a top hat. So maybe the focus is on youth, not class. I'm not completely certain. But whatever the precise nuance, though, it is certainly an early 20th century pre-Foucauldian reflection on the museum as a mechanism of discipline, punishment, social control, and exclusion. And it's not the only one around the same time. A very similar point is made in a cartoon from 1898, where we see an old man in a gallery who thinks he needs a bit more fresh air, so tries to open a window which was actually a window depicted in the painting, and he too gets copped. And the real-life version of this power and control is exemplified here in, this is a section of the Malicious Damage Act of 1861, which threatens prison plus hard labour or whipping for damaging any museum object. These are all nice illustrations, I think, of how for more than a century the museum as an institution, and I'm generalizing wildly here, and I know I am, I'm doing it on purpose. Museum as an institution has been the site of disagreement and conflict, and of how, I think throughout their modern history, museums have been the lightning rods for cultural debate, as well as attracting protest and violence. As you see, the same painting, Velázquez's Rokeby Venus in the National Gallery, was the target of suffragette, Mary Richardson in 1914, and of Just Stop Oil last year. The point I want to underline is that it is easy to kid ourselves that we are the first clever generation to have questioned the ideology of the museum. And it's easy to imagine that for centuries, museums were the confident and complacent representatives of national values and of social and cultural hierarchies. And it is only, of course, us who have seen through all that complacency to the big questions and troubling exclusions that you find beneath that surface. How is the museum policed? Who owns the museum object? Where does cultural heritage actually belong? Now, to imagine it's only us who've seen through these questions is, I think, a self-serving, sanctimonious, presentist fallacy. The issues that we have with the museum are old issues. And part of the museum's job has always been to be a reasonably safe space to argue about how we see the world, its histories, and its structures of power, and self-referentially to explore the museum's own irresolvable paradoxes. For me, that's what's exciting about museums. Or to put that another way, museums would be failing if they were not controversial, if they were not making us edgy. Paradoxically, that's a point I think that is signalled by the classical form of many large traditional museums. We now tend to deplore the message that these facades transmit, as if they were somehow intended to put off those who already felt they were excluded from the cultural hierarchy they represent. We tend to forget that the origin of this museum design was partly a knowing gesture to the secular, civic, citizenly, and argumentative space that was signalled by the Greco-Roman world. Now, against that general background, I would argue that we don't now properly face up to the necessarily ambivalent terrain that museums occupy, and the combination of love and loathing that defines them. We continue to create more and more and more of them, so that in the UK, depending on what exactly you count as a museum, the number of them has risen from around 1,000 in 1960 to about 2,500 now. That's a slight decrease because of funding cuts from the height of the 2010s. Even the best museums, and I don't have to tell some of you here this, even the best museums are strapped for cash. But be that as it may, strapped for cash or not, it would seem from the outside, I think, that Western culture has become terribly museumified. You know, every interest group wants its own museum, right? Whether that's the Museum of the Teapot or the Museum of Scottish Lighthouses or whatever. And most urban regeneration schemes, and I've looked them up, include as part of the regeneration a brand new museum, even if what people really want is a decent supermarket. In a wider context, I sort of suspect that the Western desire to spread museums to parts of the world that have always done just fine without them will one day be seen as colonialism's last gasp. Yet, at the same time as we invest this cultural energy in museums and making more of them, we also use them as dumping grounds for things we want to put away. When, for example, we say that we want to put toppled statues of past villains in a museum where they can be properly contextualized within a historical framework, what we really mean is that we want to forget about them. A good example of this is the Citadel Museum at Spandau on the outskirts of Berlin. This museum brilliantly traces the city's history through its now removed statues, from time-expired aristocrats and clerics, through Nazi youth, to East German border guards, and a really massive head of Lenin. It has attracted no end of museological plaudits for its brilliance. There's only one problem: almost no one visits it. And I think it kind of sums up the bottom line for me, which is that museums and their storerooms are full of stuff that, for different reasons, we don't want to be bothered with, even if we can't actually throw them away. I want now to focus a bit more closely on some particular issues that come out of that, from censorship and policing to questions about the rules of display and disputes about ownership. I should warn you that I am not going to discuss this evening the big current controversies of restitution. I'm not shying away from them, but some of the big headline issues that they involve, issues of theft, violent appropriation, and empire, important as they are, actually conceal the fact that rival stakeholding in objects, fighting over who has what where, is almost inseparable from the museum, and we might do well to think about those embedded issues more carefully. It might help us think about the more controversial ones. Okay, let's start with the segregation of objects within the museum. The prohibitions that we still place on seeing certain things, or sometimes on certain people seeing certain things. Putting so-called erotic images out of bounds to women and children is often now dismissed in the museum context as a predictable and slightly silly bit of 19th century prudery, which gradually gave way to a more liberal regime. But it isn't actually so simple. The ancient erotica from Pompeii and from elsewhere in the Museum of Naples placed off-limits for women, children, and priests in the early 19th century tells a more complicated story, not one of a gradual liberal opening up, but of cultural power politics, always at play around the question of who can see what in the museum's space, and who decides. Garibaldi, for example, liberated the so-called secret cabinet in the Naples Museum in 1860, after he'd liberated the city of Naples. But it was soon shut up again. And those ups and downs in policies of exclusion at Naples went on until the early 1960s. In some ways, it was the 1950s that saw the most restrictive regime, when the principle not so much of who you were, but why you wanted to see the material that became crucial. Scholarship, yes. Casual gawping, no. And there was no shortage of debate about the revealing inconsistencies of it all. At one stage in the 19th century, captured in this photograph, the museum put all the naked Venuses together in a men-only zone. Power play it certainly was, but people were very soon pointing to the illogicality of banning women from seeing statues that were, more or less, statues of themselves. The reductio ad absurdum of all this came in 2000, when the Naples Museum mocked up a complete fantasy replica of the so-called secret cabinet, complete with a barred metal door, but open now to all comers. Still there, and it's still acting out its own version of contested exclusion and encouraging visitors to pretend that they have been allowed to see the forbidden, which isn't actually any longer forbidden at all. So it's playing, I think, either inadvertently or advertently with that museum paradox. There is a Cambridge variation on this theme in what was a very heated local scandal in 1856, when the Vice-Chancellor, William Whewell, went into the Fitzwilliam over the Christmas vacation. He had a key, so he could let himself in, and rehung in side rooms, much less prominently, the group of nudes that had previously greeted visitors at the top of the main stairs. He explained that as the museum had recently been open to the public indiscriminately, it appears to be quite necessary for the credit of the university that it should be possible to pass through the gallery without looking at such pictures. For Whewell, although others at the time loudly disagreed, it was education with its social status that determined who should see what in the museum. Now, one of the paintings that Whewell moved was Titian's Rape of Lucretia, one that some have come to feel edgy about again, though for rather different reasons. But our own anxieties about what should or should not be on display, and we still have those anxieties, have come to focus much more on religious objects and more than anything on human remains. That concern actually goes back further than you might think. Already in 1949, the director of the British Museum, John Forsdyke, publicly opposed the display of Egyptian mummies. I do not know when they were first shown, he said, a bit pompously, but their exhibition is probably related to the time when corpses were common objects of respectable curiosity. And like almost all museum directors ever since, all over the world, he went on to grapple with the awkward paradox that these remains had also long been, as you see here, some of the biggest crowd pullers in his museum. He ended up just banning postcards of them being put on sale, which is, of course, another nice museum illogicality. You can come and look at the real thing under the museum's careful watch, but you can't take a small two-dimensional representation back home. Right? A broader issue is, I suppose, the contested ideology of how these objects are arranged. What goes where in the museum? What next to what? And what does that say about the worldview the museum is validating? Now, we're familiar with modern studies which regularly show that in Western museums, non-Western cultures tend to be marginalised in less splendid galleries and less prominent locations. If you're looking for the African collection, the basement is usually a good place to start. But those issues also go way back. They were tied up with Whewell's rehang. His lead question was what paintings should be the most prominent. But a clearer example is another local case. The museum, as you see here, that opened in 1884 in what is now Peterhouse Library and Theatre. It then housed, together, in a large, broadly open plan arrangement, the collection of plaster casts that form the Museum of Classical Archaeology, now the Sidgwick site, and the local archaeological remains and ethnographic collections that are now the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, including considerable material from Fiji collected under the auspices of Baron von Hugel. This unusual combination divided those who gave speeches at the opening celebrations, who were local academics, plus a sprinkling of the metropolitan great and good. Some of the speakers applauded the juxtaposition, suggesting that there was an intellectual gain in seeing such different things side by side. Others wrestled with the incongruences. There was plenty of praise for the plaster casts, precisely because, as one speaker put it, they were harmless replicas. Not, he said, objects stolen from the only places where they can have their full value. That's 1884. Remember, people are making that argument. The speaker was actually Arthur Evans, the excavator of Canossos's father-in-law. But they wondered, how did that harmlessness of the replica fit with the fact that the Fijian objects were not replicas, but the real thing, and may well have been, on some definitions, stolen. Von Hugel himself was acclaimed by another speaker as having, quotes, distinguished himself by taking a journey into the interior of Fiji and bringing away the skulls of the narrowest-headed men to be found in the world. That was the anthropologist Tyler, I think. A lot of soul-searching then led the museum management the very next year after the museum had opened to erect a wooden partition between the plaster casts and the ethnographica, so you could not see them together. By 1913, the local archaeology and ethnographic collections had moved out into their own museum, leaving the plaster casts behind. Now, that isn't just a little Victorian curiosity. It's a reminder that there is no such thing as an innocent museum arrangement, and we are not the first generation to have important and unavoidable debates about what goes where and how we deal with the contradictions of display, not necessarily by partition. But this example, particularly the Fijian example, also nudges us gently in the direction of disputed ownership. I said a few moments ago that I wasn't going to dive in to big current controversies, and I'm not. It's worth stating, though, that virtually no one, not even in the current government, thinks that all objects now in Western museums should stay where they are. Almost everyone recognises that there are injustices of theft, violence, deception and exploitation that could and should be put right. The question is which injustices and which objects and on which criteria. Conversely, there is virtually no one who thinks that all pieces in museums should be returned to the places they were made. Achille Mbembe hit the nail on the head when he asked, do we really want to live in a world where everyone and everything has to go back home? It's also worth posing a few obvious questions that tend to get evaded. I'll give some particular examples in a minute, but the big questions include some basic issues as, on what precise principles do we decide where an object should be seen, or, because this is different, who owns it? Do we accept or reject the paradox that comes with the modern nation state, that the state owns the material objects found in its soil from a period before it, the state, ever existed, and with no connection to it beyond the happenstance of geography? It's a convenient rule of thumb, but it's not incontestable, and it's proved particularly unhelpful in resolving claims to indigenous art within the modern nation state. And then there's the even trickier question of how we understand ownership in the case of those material objects that are deemed to be part of world heritage. Now, controversies about where objects should be and be seen are also centuries old. They're almost always complex, and they're disputed on shifting or unargued principles, and they're not always transnational. In fact, most claims to objects and most objections to museum holdings do not involve imperial looting or colonial theft. They are local. In the UK, there are long-standing grievances, for example, about the Great Bed of Ware being owned by and housed in the V&A rather than in Ware. It was originally constructed as a tourist attraction for a pub in the town in the late 16th century. It changed hands several times until the last owner, who didn't live in Ware, sold it to the museum, which has been pressed to give it back, though to whom exactly is not very clear. Likewise, the Lewis chess pieces, made of whalebone in the late 12th century and dug up in the sand dunes on the Isle of Lewis in 1831. Most of them since then have been owned by the British Museum, some by the National Museum of Scotland, and some of the pieces are displayed from time to time on loan to Lewis, while regular demands are made to return all of them there, on the basic principle that the Lewis chessmen belong in Lewis. One complication, though, is that they have very little connection with Lewis at all. They were almost certainly made in Norway, and they were dropped in Lewis by someone bringing them west, probably to sell. He or she somehow lost them, after which they spent several hundred years in a sand dune. And it's not only a British issue. Try the extraordinary pieces of Roman sculpture from the village of Sperlonga in central Italy, discovered during road building in 1957 and now on display in a small museum on the site. Most visitors walk straight past the plaque at the entrance to the museum, which records a speech of the archaeologist Marcello Gigante about the finds at Sperlonga and their proper place. The people of Sperlonga, he said, held out with tenacious dedication against the idea that these precious discoveries should be transported into the omnivorous maw of Rome. Glory to the proud old ladies in black, to the fearless young men for realizing that the archaeological heritage should stay in the very spot where it had come back to light. So, same story, but a different ending. These cases show the different stakeholders that many objects have and the different priorities between which it can be very hard to adjudicate. We see the meaningfulness of objects to particular communities pitted against the role of the centre or even against the interests of the wider public. When the Great Bed of Ware did go to Ware for a year, it was seen by about 1/10 of the people who saw it in the V&A. And the focus of all this, the lightning rod, if you like, is the museum in the metropolis, seen as the omnivorous maw. Now, my own gut instinct, for what it's worth, is that the Sperlonger sculptures do belong in Sperlonger. But I don't know how I would logically justify Gigante's claim that the archaeological heritage should stay in the very spot where it had come back to light. No one in Sperlonger had seen the bloody stuff for almost 2,000 years, so I'm not quite sure what sense its location makes. If you want just one final wonderful century-old example of these ambiguities, it's the so-called Breuter hoard, an extraordinary collection of Iron Age gold of probably the 1st century BCE. It's now in the National Museum of Ireland. It was found by farmers in County Londonderry in 1896, sold to a local dealer, and then sold on to the British Museum, apparently perfectly legally. But soon, and obviously against the background of the Irish nationalist movement, the Royal Irish Academy claimed it should be in Ireland. The case was finally adjudicated in 1903, when the hoard was legally classified as treasure trove, and so the property of the Crown. Edward VII promptly presented it to the National Museum of Ireland in Dublin, where it still is. Though, of course, the irony is that since 1922, it has therefore been in a different nation from that in which it was found, Londonderry being part of the United Kingdom. And that question of treasure trove only adds to the complexity. According to legislation that amazingly applied until 1997, buried precious objects were deemed to be treasure trove, and so the property of the Crown, if they had been buried by someone who buried them with the intention to come back and retrieve them, only didn't, right? If they were buried with no intention to retrieve, they were the property of whoever later found them. Now, if you find something destabilizingly crazy in the idea of a modern British court of law trying to decide, as it did, the intentions of an Iron Age bloke or woman wandering around Derry with their gold in the 1st century BCE, I can promise you you're not the only one, right? But that was, as I said, what happened until 1997. In the Breuter case, Arthur Evans, to give him a second name check, was an expert witness on the losing side because he claimed that this was, in his view, a dedication to the gods. So said Iron Age bloke never intended to come and get it back, right? But he lost. But I think it's more than crazy. It's also a symbol of the desperate lengths that even sensible people have to go to pin down ownership across time, whether that's inside or outside the museum. So what are the implications of all this? I hope I haven't inadvertently given the gloomy impression that the modern museum is all about problems, disputes, and ambivalences. It might be, but that's not what I'm saying. My point is quite the reverse. It's all those big questions that actually make museums so exciting, that give you the buzz when you go in and challenge your certainties. Even if it were possible, we wouldn't want to have museums whose ordering of the past or of the world was universally agreed. Shoring up orthodoxy isn't the job of the museum, nor is it the job of history more generally. The slogan about the past being a foreign country is one very dangerous cliche here. Like all cliches, it is partly true. But it's justified seeing the past as a separate zone. It's helped us to refuse to see the past, not as belonging to people in the past, but as very largely ours and owned by us, to do with responsibly as we want, and, more important, to sit at the hearts of our own debates. When historians get challenged for debating, say, the legacy of Churchill or of empire, they should not for one moment think of apologising. Their job, and I'm putting this carefully, their job is to explain that that is history doing its job. It may seem to some of us that that's stating the bleeding obvious, but sometimes the bleeding obvious needs stating. Democratic debate is founded on how we discuss the past, and we need places to do that, and we need people with knowledge to help us and to underpin that project. That is a necessity, not an added luxury extra. But I have perhaps missed out one thing that applies to both the museum and to history more generally, and that is the idea of wonder. It's better in Greek, thauma. Thauma is not just wonder, it's a kind of destabilizing again combination of the gobsmacking and the mind-changing. Now, when I read the words of a Roman emperor written 2,000 years ago, or I see the everyday ceramics of the 5th century BC Athens in the Fitzwilliam, when I am looking and reading across time, I am as struck by the same kind of cognitive disruption that I suspect physicists feel about black holes, or probably as Clerk Maxwell felt about the telephone. It makes me see things and see myself differently. Thauma is one of history's most powerful weapons. And just to finish, I want to say that it was this that in fact started me off on my own exploration of the past in a story that is the absolute reverse of The Boy Who Breathed on the Glass. I was 5 years old and we lived in rural Shropshire, and my mum had decided that I should go to London, and one of the places we visited was the British Museum, where, of course, like the boy in the cartoon, I wanted to see the mummies. That done, we went on to the Egyptian Everyday Life galleries. Now, if you remember, some of you might, museums back then, they weren't what we now call child-friendly. The display cases were very high, and if you were 5, you couldn't really see in them. My mum had spotted at the back of one case a piece of Egyptian bread or cake, I believe it to be this, 4,000 years old, which she wanted to show me. She had to lift me up, but she was weighed down with the bags and I was a bit wriggly and it wasn't going at all well. I'm sure I must have breathed on the glass, but I didn't get arrested or banged up for life. Instead, a man walked by and asked me what I was trying to see. "That piece of cake," I squeaked. He must have been a curator, for straight away, he got a bunch of keys out of his pocket, he unlocked the case, he extracted the cake and held it right in front of my eyes. And I can tell you, it was magic. It was absolute magic. It was thauma in the most Herodotean sense of the word thauma. And it changed my life. And it was also an important lesson, which I hope I learned or started to learn then, that beyond all the exciting contestations of the museum, it is the job of the museum professional, or more widely of the historian, to open up cases for kids and for grown-ups, sometimes metaphorically, but sometimes literally. So I suppose what I want to say is that every day of my life I thank that anonymous man who must be long dead who opened up the case for me. I hope that we do it for other people, and I want to thank you for coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary. We are open for questions. I'm going to call on people, and Mary's going to answer the questions. Please raise your hands, and I will do my best. We've got mics roving around, so wait for a mic to reach you.
I'm not allowed to drink yet, so you've got to have some questions before we're all allowed to have a glass of wine. Or comments or disagreements.
Here's one.
Oh, there's Luke. Thank you, Luke.
Mary, I think thank you very much for an absolutely fascinating talk. I loved the way you ranged. Can I just ask, or perhaps challenge you a little though, on this question of the sense of the museum as its own sense of itself as a place where safe debate could take place. Which you called, I can't remember, you had a wonderful phrase which suggested it was a piece of self-indulgence of today, that sense of a disputed space. Isn't one of the points of the Bateman cartoon, though, that actually it is about controlling knowledge and message, and therefore the boy who intervenes in a particular way is challenging that, and that was also acknowledged in a suffragette attack on a work which is therefore, in a sense, an attack on an establishment institution.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of levels and meta levels of this, and to be honest, I'm not very certain. I wish more museums sat down and said, how are we going to get people really arguing about us? That's what I'd like to see happening. How are we going to annoy people just enough to have a good argument? I think, though, that although there's very little of that kind of explicitation, what you find is you find it at the edges. So you find it as it's challenged. And I mean, I do find the Bateman cartoon a bit puzzling because the kid is rich. And it's clear when you look at it, that's not how we now read it. We kind of now read it as a manifesto for inclusion. Well, it is inclusion in a certain sense, but not what we're talking about. But I was very surprised to discover quite a lot more. So that I suppose when I'm going to get out of jail free here. When I'm thinking about the museum, I'm thinking about it as an institution, which exists in physical form, but I'm also thinking about it as a thing that people argue. I'm thinking about the museum as an idea, as well as an institution. And then it's much easier for me to, as it were, to package those things all in together. Oh, no, the Malicious Damage Act of 1861, I only discovered about that because I'd shown the boy who breathed on the glass at a lecture, and someone from Oldham Museum said, we had this used to be pinned up on the wall of our museum. And that, that's somehow more amazing than the cartoons. And it always, and you're never quite certain, do we think it was ever, I need to be a legal historian and go and find out how often that was enforced. Is it kind of display? I can partly think it's a bit like the notices on the first class carriage of the King's Cross trains from Cambridge, which says, if you dirty squit with a standard class ticket sits in here, you could be liable for a 3-month prison sentence. And you think, you know, this is so barking mad. You know, this will one day be in a book about how mad the early 21st century could be. And possibly, I think it's the same with the Malicious Damage Act, you know. So I'd like to know how many prosecutions there were. But I think, I mean, you're right. I think what I should say is the institution is about its physicality, and it's about all the way people talk about it and joke about it, and that sort of, put that in the same bag. Can I just say one thing, and then it was, Bateman didn't hate the British Museum, or at least when he gave the cartoon, he gave the original drawing to the British Museum. So that adds another kind of,
that's very good.
Sorry, Paul.
Up here.
I'm now going to get told off about the Great Bed of Ware, I think.
Go ahead, up here.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
I'm here.
Yes, I see you. Go ahead.
Let me will you wave your hand so I can look in the right direction? Oh, right.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Baird. As a student in museum education, I really thank you for your speech, and it's also quite related to my topic, as I am investigating museum as a educational place for the public and for like a wider visitors and audience. And I wonder, as an educator yourself, like how do you think about the interconnections between research and curation, as well as education, the potentials within the institutions?
I think they're absolutely essential. And I'm now going to show my elderliness by saying I always get very, very uneasy when people say they want to go to a museum to find themselves. I think the one thing you don't find in a museum is yourself. You find things that might occasionally overlap with yourself, but very different. And I think that, and I'm saying this specifically in front of the Vice-Chancellor, who might have hands on some money bags, I think that the idea of ever really separating any kind of level of research or teaching from the museum collection, of saying, you don't need to know about this object. I mean, I think what I didn't include was how important expertise and knowing things is. And it, you know, I'm going to sound like such an awful old fusty. You know, the idea that museums are just for kind of enjoying yourself, I mean, in one particular definition of enjoying yourself, I think is really undermining their point. And they linked it. I don't think you can see the museum quite as a metaphor for all historical inquiry, but not far off, honestly. And I think that kind of education it goes right through. It goes from somebody who's going to spend 20 years of their life, this is an exaggeration and a parody, studying, you know, medieval donkey bones in a museum, to a kid who's never been there, and it's the first time they've gone. And you are seeing their past there for you, right? And I think that's hugely important. And so the more we combine, I think at every level, education, research, and knowing, and seeing those things in terms of argument, right? This is not kind of passive. This is about the past. The past is of no interest unless we argue about it, completely none, right? We've got to disagree and debate and think about how it means. So I think that there could be nothing more important than the kind of project of research and education. And a great place where I recently saw that happening was Leighton House Museum in London. Frederick Leighton, who actually was at the opening of the Museum of Classical Archaeology, actually, and gave a rather posh speech. You know, he was the most glaring Orientalist in the planet. And Leighton House, which he created for himself as his home and studio, was covered with the most kind of in-your-face, orientalizing fake tiles. And it has recently been given a makeover by Kensington Council. And they had quite a lot of money, and they've got a great new education programme. And before I went to see it, I thought, God, this is a hard nut to crack. You know, you've got, a lot of the Muslim, Arabic background community of North Kensington. It's going to be hard showing this off. When I went and saw it, I was absolutely amazed at how they turned this kind of Orientalist palace into a space where kids were arguing, all kids of different origins, whatever. They were arguing about whether they thought this was a good representation of the Islamic world or not. And some of them thought it was wonderful. Some of them thought that it was infantilizing. But these were kids of, they weren't using the word infantilizing, they were kids of 9 and 10. And they were going at each other, hammer and tongs. And again, this was where it's a safe space, because they were in the museum and they were allowed to do it, and it wasn't about themselves in that kind of way. And I was really gobsmacked with what you could do just by lighting the blue touch paper and letting them go at it. So,
thank you.
Paul.
You partly answered my question, which is how can museums become a more effective civic forum for nuanced debate? Because what we have is quite unnuanced debate a lot of the time.
Yeah.
So how can we all do a better job at making that debate civilized, but at the same time, confrontational when it needs to be?
Yeah. Paul knows a lot more about museums than I do, I should say. I think you have to be braver. I mean, museums can be terribly risk-averse from top to bottom, right? One of the ways you see that is, nothing's ever got out of the case, and because it might get broken, right? I once said in a kind of museum gathering, and I thought I was going to get shot, really did. It really wouldn't matter if a couple of Greek pots every now and then got broken. And I thought, because it wouldn't, there is plenty more where they came from. There's not a shortage. But we lock all the bloody things away. And actually, this was in Chicago, and they said, yeah, that's true. That's absolutely true. So I think they're risk-averse in that way. But they argue a lot internally. If you go behind the scenes at museum after dark, everybody's having a good argument about things, but they're terribly risk-averse now about sharing it. And I think you have to accept it's going sometimes to be awkward and uncomfortable. But the museum and the museum staff and the museum culture does learn from that. And I think it has so much to lose by, as it were, even beginning to think of itself as a sort of temple of culture. And that is, I think that is the point about the classical facades. That we do think that means temple of culture, and then we say, oh yes, descended from the museum, the temple of the muses. What they were doing in the 18th and 19th century was saying, this is not a church, people can come here, and this is secular civic space, and secular civic space is about having a good old argument. And we've lost that, and it kind of sometimes that strays into the arguments about history that we have outside the museum, that we don't want to go there. Well, that's letting everybody down. History is there for us to use for our own benefit as we want. And if we don't use it, we don't deserve to have it, I think.
Okay.
Simon.
We have a question up here.
Thank you very much. You mentioned earlier museums as a dumping ground. That resonates with me very well. I'm an archaeologist by profession, so I know that there is so much that is excavated which then disappears into a museum or an institution archive and is never seen again, never published upon academically or otherwise for various reasons. I'm of the perspective that much of this knowledge withheld, is as good as knowledge dead. Do you have any reflections on how historians and other heritage professionals should approach this knowledge that is eaten by the museum?
I think I've got different answers to that. I'll give you just a couple. One is, I think that the general policy of, let's say, in the UK, national museums, the policy not to deaccession, not to give away or sell away or throw away objects in the museum's care, in the long term is probably a very good one. And whatever else it's meant to do, it's meant to ensure that swings and roundabouts of fashion don't mean that we get rid of a bag of boring old, very important Romano-British pottery from the local villa that in 20 years' time or 1,000 years' time will really be able to be opened up and will become valued, and that we will be able to look at it again. So I think to some extent you have to take the rough with the smooth and to say that perfectly, in my view, correct hoarding nature is going to mean that there are museum basements stuffed with things that people don't look at, but at least they're there. I think that at a wider level, I think I don't like the bad faith about put it in a museum. You see it all the time. Let's say we've got a statue of a slave trader, let's say, Mr. Anonymous slave trader. He's come down. What are we going to do with him? Right. There are many options, but the favoured one usually is put him in a museum, right? There's a very nice museum of slavery in Liverpool. Put him in the slavery museum. And then we can contextualise him, and there can be a good label that he would do more, he would do some good there. And the argument about that argument is absolutely fine as it stands. But I think, who do I want to think about slavery, right? Well, I want everybody to think about slavery, but I think I particularly want, some people of the alt-right who might actually think they don't mind about it very much, Oh, it's in the past, it's what they did then, et cetera, et cetera. And I think Mr. Alt-right doesn't say to his family, Mrs. Alt-right and two junior alt-right, I know what we're going to do this afternoon, darling, let's go to the Museum of Slavery. Somehow it means that it's being put away, or put away where only the converted see it, right? And so I think that there's a sense of, we feel better because we think, I don't want actually to smash it, so we'll put it in the museum. And I think we have to think a bit more carefully. And it's part of, in a sense, your whole question, really. It's part of what we want to see or what we don't want to see, or what we think the museum contains. Now, I'm now not speaking as a trustee of the British Museum, so don't for a minute imagine that I am. But when you see statistics like the British Museum has got 8 million objects or whatever, you want to ask for the second statistic, which is how many of those are larger than 2 inches in diameter. And the answer is about half of them, right? So there is a sort of view of the museum, and there are competing, there are competing aims and functions, one of which is to you know, store things we don't want to throw away. I've got plenty of them. My whole house, in a way, is a little museum. It's storing things I don't want to throw away. But we've just got to be a bit more real about it, I think.
Okay, last question.
Oh, God, Simon. Turn the mic on, mate.
Try again. Is that good?
Yes.
Yeah, that's gone. Right. I love the story about the little girl in the museum and your Thelma. But it's a story that obviously relates to one little girl at a contingent moment. It just happened. Do you think a museum can actually bottle Thelma? Can it actually make Thelma happen? And if so, how?
I don't know if everybody heard that. Can a museum make Thelma happen? It bloody well should try. And I think sometimes it does. And I think you don't always know when and how or for whom Thelma is going to work. You're right, that this was one little girl being lifted up and a guy just happened. The contingency of that is extraordinary and unreplicable in some ways. But I think that that's what museums are meant to do. And that should be the aim. And I think, you see, in the end, what I was trying to see was only a piece of bread or cake. You know, I didn't want to get my sticky mitts on a piece of gold. I just wanted to get close to a little bit of bread. Happened to be 4,000 years old. And I think we can do that more than we do. One of the things that I used to enjoy most, although it is now off limits in the Museum of Classical Archaeology, is having primary school kids in and passing around some really crap Greek pots, right? You know, bought in the 1960s for very cheap at Christie's or Sotheby's, bought for students to hold. Just, it's fun holding a Greek pot. It's exciting. Now, all these Greek pots are now locked away, but the eyes of their kids, when you handed this round and they said, "Is this real?" You know, and you said, "Yes." Now, that wasn't, that was planned. It wasn't contingent. And some kids thought, "Oh, what am I going on here about?" But for others, Thelma was happening. And, I think that would be my motto for the museum. We could have it in Greek, and that would make it even more wondrous, wouldn't it? Thelma. So we'll have a banner on the Fitzwilliam, perhaps we could phrase that, just said, "Thelma happens here." There's a challenge.
We can continue this conversation outside over drinks. Please join me in thanking our lecturer.
Thank you.
Now you get your drink.